Hello and welcome to today's episode of pianoTV. I am Allysia, your host, and today we are going to be taking a closer look at Chopin's very famous Opus 66 Fantaisie-Impromptu composition for solo piano. Pretty much everything Chopin wrote is for solo piano. It's approximately 5 minutes long from start to finish, so it's a very digestible length. Again, like a lot of Chopin's music are miniatures, so they're easier to listen to in a sense. And it's also, I don't want to say this is easier to play, but compared to last video when we talked about the hardest Chopin music ever, this one is quite a bit more doable. It's still a high level piece though. In today's video, we're going to talk a little bit about the backstory of this piece and then get into a musical analysis of it. But don't worry if you're not super well versed in classical music or music theory or anything like that, because I try to make this approachable for even the most casual of music listeners. Let's get started. This Fantaisie-Impromptu was written in 1834 by Chopin, but he never published it in his lifetime. And he actually made specific notes that he didn't want any of his unpublished works to be published when he died. But of course, you know, no one's going to listen to a dead guy, and a lot of Chopin's posthumous works are a part of his collections and are very well-loved compositions today, including this one. This piece was written in the key of C sharp minor, just like Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and that is not the only comparison between the two, and we will talk about that more in a moment. My cat wanted to play piano, apparently. This Fantaisie-Impromptu is one of Chopin's most performed and most well-known compositions, so you've probably heard it at some point on, you know, popular media or anything like that, even if you're not that into classical music. It's pretty well known. This impromptu is the fourth in a series of impromptus by Chopin, and this is the only one that was not published in his lifetime. So why did Chopin leave this one unpublished? Well, Chopin dedicated it to his close friend Julian Fontana, and Julian was the one who published it in 1855 after Chopin's death. It's thought that since it was so similar to Moonlight Sonata, Chopin might have not wanted to publish it. Another version of the impromptu was discovered by Arthur Barenboim, a version that Chopin had seemingly updated a year later. Perhaps Chopin didn't want to publish it because maybe he was still working out the details. Both Chopin's Fantaisie-Impromptu and Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata are in the key of C sharp minor, and they have a lot in common tonally and harmonically, especially the third movement of the sonata, which is what's on the screen here. They both have a middle section in D flat major. So in the sonata, it would be the second movement. In the impromptu, it would just be like the B section. They both have similar runs and a driving sense of urgency. Beethoven's is marked presto agitato and Chopin's is marked allegro agitato. So basically just like very fast and agitated and fast and agitated. Ernst Oster, a musicologist, wrote, Chopin understood Beethoven to a degree that no one who has written on the C sharp minor sonata or the Fantaisie-Impromptu has ever understood him. The Fantaisie-Impromptu is perhaps the only instance where one genius discloses to us, if only by means of a composition of his own, what he actually hears in the work of another genius. We're going to take a listen to the introduction of Beethoven's third movement from his Moonlight Sonata, and then immediately after, we're going to dive into the intro of the Fantaisie-Impromptu. Listen for that similar vibe. Beethoven's is more intense, whereas Chopin's is a little more nocturnal. So now that we've talked about Chopin's musical inspiration for the impromptu, let's start discussing its musical features. In this composition, you'll find polyrhythm, which is where there's like one hand is each doing its own rhythm. So in this case, one hand's doing 16th notes, another's doing triplets. You will find cut time in the A section, and then standard 4/4 time in the B section. Cut time, 2/2 time is just generally more energetic, whereas 4/4 is more standard, has a little bit more flow. And then you have a key change from part A to part B. We're going from C sharp minor to D flat major, which is the parallel major because C sharp and D flat is the same key on the piano. You just don't usually hear about C sharp major on the piano. It's one of those weird music theory things where there would be way too many sharps on the page. It would look super confusing. Whereas D flat major looks more normal. There's less flats. It's easier to keep track of, even though The notes are all the same. Chopin made an interesting decision to end on a major chord, which we call a tierce de Picardy in this, and it is in ternary form, ABA, 3-part form. Before we dig into the analysis of this particular Fantaisie-Impromptu, let's talk about what an impromptu is in the first place, just to give you a little bit of context. Basically, an impromptu is kind of what it sounds like. It's an improvised musical composition, or at least the concept of it was improvised before the composer wrote it down. So impromptus will typically have a pretty simple structure, like ternary form, ABA, meaning that there's part 1, A, and then a different part, B, and then a return to the first part, A, sometimes with a coda. But for the most part, it's written in a very free-form style. It's a little bit rule-breaking. And a fantasy is very similar. One simple difference between the two is impromptus came into existence in the Romantic era in the 1800s, whereas fantasies were like they existed in the Baroque period. Bach wrote fantasies, Mozart wrote fantasies, and yeah, it's basically a composition written with the spirit of improvisation in mind. What you'll see on the screen here is just the basic structure of the Fantaisie-Impromptu. It's in ABA form, as mentioned, which is 3-part ternary form, and then once that's over, there's a coda. And we're going to go through each of these parts and have a few listing examples so you can get a sense of what this piece is all about. Let's look at the first section, part A. This section has a really stormy and restless feel, agitated, like the tempo marking would suggest to us in the beginning. The thing about the polyrhythm in this section is that it isn't too hard to play either hand separately, but it's really tough to play both hands at the same time because they're different rhythms. The right hand is playing 16th notes and the left hand is playing 8th note triplets, which means every third note. So basically it's going to be grouped like this, and some of the 16th notes are going to kind of go in between the 8th notes. They're not hitting at the same time. The only notes that are actually hitting on the same time are every third 8th note. We've already listened to the main theme of the A section at the beginning of this video, so let's have a look at the second theme. These themes are simply musical ideas that recur throughout the piece. In this part, you'll hear the melody in the middle register of the piano, which you can see indicated by the accent notes. So here are the accents. They're telling us to press a little bit louder on these mid-register notes to bring out that melody. This ends up being a lot of work for the thumb, but it's essential to crank these notes out if the audience is to actually hear the melody. This part also sounds a little happier since it moves to the relative major key of E major. Let's have a listen to that. The A section culminates in a big descending chromatic scale and left hand octave melody over here that digs lower and lower and lower. And this gives us a feeling that things are looking really grim, kind of like falling into a pit. But instead of crashing, Chopin doesn't let us hit the ground. We are then whisked off into a much sunnier B section. So now we are in the middle of the D flat major key section, the B section. We start off with a tempo marking of largo, which is quickly followed by the marking moderato cantabile. Moderately is the speed, and then cantabile is just in a singing style. The right-hand melody in this section really does sing. It's super lovely. I always encourage my students to come up with their own stories for pieces like this. And for me, this whole piece actually reminds me of a dream. It's like in the A section, the dream is really scary. Like maybe you're running away from something and then you're free falling through the sky. Like, you know, those dreams when you're falling. But instead of falling and crashing to your doom, you fall through a loophole or something like that, or like a portal into another world, one that's golden and serene. It sounds kind of silly when I'm describing all of this out loud, but those are the kinds of images and imaginings that really help bring a composition to life in your own mind. There aren't any words in classical music pieces for the most part, unless you're listening to opera. There's no words to tell you what the story is. So it's nice to create the story yourself. Anyway, that's enough of my rant. Let's have a listen to this part. That golden, dreamy sequence carries on and repeats for a couple of minutes before it transitions back into the stormy A section. There isn't a dramatic build-up, though, in the transition. Rather, you just have this, like, lovely major key sound dissipating. Ritenuto means getting slower. You can kind of see the melody drops off. It's almost like this part was never there. Like, this was the dream. And then once we get back to the A section, that's, like, dark reality. I really like how the pianissimo volume at the end and that small little slowdown gives it a feeling of like a pleasant dream evaporating. But again, those are just my images. Let's have a listen. Maybe you can create your own images. And that takes us to the final A section. This is marked presto, so it's faster and more agitated than the original A section, though in some versions of the sheet music it will just be marked allegro, like in the beginning. Whenever a part repeats like this, so you have part A, part B, and now we're back at part A repeating, it's generally a good performance idea to spice it up a bit so it's different. Some performers will go faster like this, they'll play it presto, and more agitated, while other performers might find like a quieter sound, and so on. So when you're listening to recordings of this, you'll keep an ear out for how performances vary the two same sections to make them sound a bit different. The coda explodes with a fortissimo that slowly melts away into a major key sound. The main climactic moments of the piece is here in the coda, but it is followed by like true peace in the last 30 seconds or so. We're not going to listen to the whole ending just because it kind of trails on for a long time, but you'll get the idea. And then the very last chord is actually a major key. So this is what we call a tierce de Picardy. It's when you have a minor key song that ends with a major key. And I love that Chopin gives us a happy ending here. It's like the dream ends on a serene note. And that is all for today's musical analysis. I hope you enjoyed it. And we have done many of these on the channel before. We've analyzed other Chopin pieces like the 24 preludes that he wrote. We've analyzed Schubert and Mozart and a whole bunch of other guys. So if you want to get more into this, you can check out the music analysis playlist. I believe actually we call it Listening to Classical Music. But yeah, it's a playlist on this channel and has all of those in it. You can also visit the website pianotv.net and there's a tab. I think it's also called Listening to Classical Music or something along those lines, but I'm sure you can figure it out. Thank you so much for watching this video. Give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you haven't already. You can check us out on social and Patreon, and I will catch you in the next video. Well, Chopin dedicated it to